Picture this. You're starving. It's 40,000 years ago. There's no supermarket, no delivery app, no guy named Dave who'll bring you a burrito for a small fee if you tip well. There's just you, a spear you're not particularly good with, and a forest full of things that would very much like to eat you before you eat them. And then you look down, and you see it, a grub, fat, pale, wriggling, absolutely revolting to modern eyes and absolutely delicious to ancient ones. You eat it. And congratulations, you've just made one of the smartest nutritional decisions in the history of our species. Because while we love to imagine our ancestors as noble mammoth hunters, spears raised, thundering across the tundra like extras in a History Channel reenactment, the truth is way less cinematic and way, way crunchier. Ancient humans ate bugs all the time, not as a last resort, not as some desperate famine food eaten only when the crops failed and the gods had abandoned them. As a daily staple, in massive quantities across almost every continent they lived on for almost the entire span of human existence. And today we're going to dig into why an entire species decided that six-legged snacks were the move, why we mostly stopped, and why a growing number of scientists think we might be forced to start again, whether our taste buds are on board with it or not. Stick around, because by the end of this, you might genuinely be a little jealous of the diet our ancestors had. I know how that sounds. Just wait. Let's start with the obvious question. Why bugs? Out of every possible food source on planet Earth, why did our ancestors look at insects and think, yeah, that's dinner? The answer is stupidly simple once you actually sit with it. Bugs were everywhere, and bugs were basically nutritional cheat codes hiding in plain sight. Think about the math for a second. A single deer is a huge win. It's calories, it's fat, it's a hide you can turn into clothing, it's bones you can turn into tools. But a deer is also fast, has incredible hearing, and does not want to die today. Hunting one takes hours, sometimes days, and there's a very real chance you come home with nothing but bruised pride and a grumbling stomach and possibly a twisted ankle. A beetle grub, on the other hand, is not going to outrun you. It is not going to gore you with antlers. It is sitting there in a rotting log doing absolutely nothing, just marinating in its own deliciousness, waiting for you to flip open its tiny log apartment and evict it directly into your mouth. No chase, no negotiation, no consequences, unless you count the log splinters. This is what researchers call low-cost, high-reward foraging. And it's a genuinely big deal in anthropology because early humans weren't stupid. And they weren't lucky guessers either. They were running constant cost-benefit calculations, just without whiteboards or spreadsheets or a guy in a lab coat explaining the graph. Chase the deer and maybe get a huge win, or maybe get absolutely nothing, or spend 20 minutes turning over logs and guarantee yourself a meal. For a hungry human with children to feed and a stomach that doesn't care about your dignity, that's not even a hard decision. That's basic arithmetic with teeth. And here's the part that should genuinely mess with your assumptions. Bugs aren't just an easy backup plan for lazy foragers. Pound for pound, gram for gram, many insects absolutely obliterate red meat on the nutritional scoreboard. Termites, for example, can be over 40% protein by dry weight, which is a number that would make a bodybuilder weep with joy if it came from a supplement label instead of a mound of dirt. Certain beetle larvae are so loaded with fat that in an ancient world where fat was rarer and more valuable than almost anything else, they weren't a punishment food. They were a 5-star delicacy, the ancient equivalent of finding a truffle in your backyard. Crickets bring iron and B vitamins to the table like they're trying to win a nutrition award. Ants deliver calcium in quantities that would make a dairy farmer nervous about the competition. Some caterpillars are so calorie-dense that a single handful can outperform a chunk of lean meat twice its size. So when your brain pictures cavemen gnawing on mammoth ribs by firelight, looking very serious and very hairy, you should also be picturing them casually snacking on a fistful of crunchy grasshoppers like they're popcorn at a movie, because that's exactly what was happening. That was the popcorn. That was the snack aisle. That was the ancient version of grabbing chips on the way home. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this wasn't some fringe survival behavior practiced by a few desperate tribes in one dusty corner of the map. This was global. This was, quite possibly, one of the most universal human food traditions that ever existed, stretching across every inhabited continent for tens of thousands of years, quietly, consistently, without anyone writing it down because writing hadn't been invented yet. In Africa, some of the oldest evidence of tool use is directly tied to termite fishing, where early hominids would strip a stick clean, poke it carefully into a termite mound, wait with what I can only assume was intense concentration, and pull out a stick absolutely coated in termites like some kind of horrifying corn dog fresh off a fairground grill. Chimpanzees still do this today, by the way, which tells you this behavior is extremely old, possibly older than modern humans themselves. We may have literally learned this trick by watching our ape cousins figure it out first, or we share a distant common ancestor who cracked the code before either lineage even existed in its current form. In Australia, Aboriginal communities feasted on witjuti grubs, sometimes spelled witchetty grubs, for tens of thousands of years, and these things are basically nature's butter with legs. Roasted over a fire, the skin crisps up while the inside turns soft, rich, and almost creamy, like a tiny insect version of creme brulee that also happens to keep you alive through a harsh season. This wasn't a novelty snack. This was a genuinely reliable, respected food source, passed down through immense stretches of time. In the Americas, there's strong evidence that grasshoppers, ants, and agave worms were regularly eaten by indigenous peoples long before European contact ever happened. And in parts of Mexico today, you can still order chapulines, toasted grasshoppers seasoned with chili and lime, at actual sit-down restaurants, no gimmicks, no dares involved. This isn't some ancient relic dusted off for tourists. This is a living, thriving culinary tradition that simply never went anywhere, because nobody there ever convinced themselves it was gross in the first place. In Asia, evidence of insect consumption stretches back through multiple ancient cultures, with everything from silkworm pupae to water beetles showing up as completely normal menu items across centuries. In modern Thailand, Cambodia, and parts of China, insect snacking is still totally unremarkable. Sold on street carts the exact same way you'd casually buy a hot dog from a cart in New York, except arguably with more crunch and slightly less regret the next morning. So let's just pause and appreciate the scale of this for a second, because it's honestly kind of staggering. We're talking about a food behavior that appears independently, again and again in cultures that had zero contact with each other, separated by oceans, mountain ranges, and thousands of years. That's not a coincidence. That's convergent evolution of human behavior. When completely unrelated groups of people on opposite sides of a planet they hadn't even mapped yet arrive at the exact same solution without ever exchanging a single word, that's usually a very strong sign the solution is simply correct. Bugs weren't a weird cultural quirk practiced by a handful of outliers. They were the default human food. We, the people currently squirming in our seats at the thought of eating a cricket, are the weird ones now. Okay, but let's actually dig into the specific reasons, because ancient humans ate bugs is a fun fact to drop at a dinner party, but the deeper logic behind it is where this story gets genuinely fascinating. Reason number one: availability. This one's simple, but it's the foundation everything else is built on. Insects reproduce at an almost absurd rate. A single termite colony can contain literally millions of individuals living, working, and multiplying inside one mound. A swarm of locusts can number in the billions and stretch for miles across the sky. And yes, that sounds like an ancient disaster movie, and honestly, for crops, it kind of was. But for a hungry ancient human standing nearby with an open mouth and appropriately low standards, a passing locust swarm was basically an all-you-can-eat buffet. Falling directly from the heavens, no reservation required. Compare that to large game. A herd of deer might number in the dozens, spread across a huge, unpredictable territory. A family group of mammoths might be a handful of animals roaming an area the size of a small country. If you want consistent, reliable food that doesn't depend on luck, geography, or the mammoths simply feeling like showing up, you don't chase the rare stuff. You go after the abundant stuff. And nothing on this planet has ever been more abundant than insects. Scientists estimate there are more individual insects alive on Earth right now than there are stars in the entire observable universe. Let that sink in for a second, and then try to feel bad for the ancient human who decided that was worth eating. Reason number two: nutrition density. We touched on this already, but it deserves its own dedicated spotlight because it genuinely reshapes how we should picture ancient diets. High protein, high fat, loads of vitamins and minerals, all packed into a tiny, lightweight, easily transportable package that didn't require a cooler or a horse-drawn cart to carry home. And here's a detail a lot of people completely miss. Fat, not meat, was arguably the single most precious resource in the ancient diet. This sounds backwards to modern ears, because we live in a world of drive-through menus and seed oil panic where fat gets treated like the villain of every health documentary ever made. But for early humans, fat meant survival in the most literal sense. It was the most efficient way to store usable energy, and lean meat alone, without any accompanying fat, can actually become dangerous to survive on long term. A condition later explorers grimly nicknamed rabbit starvation after living through exactly that mistake. Fatty grubs and larvae solved this problem beautifully, almost elegantly. Some insect larvae are absurdly fat-rich, rivaling or even beating the fat content of many cuts of meat pound for pound. By the way, if you want to go even deeper into the secret lives of ancient humans, I just launched a full course called The Secret Lives of Ancient Humans. 10 modules, 3+ hours of content covering everything we never talk about on YouTube. What they feared, how they communicated, what hunted them, and much more. Plus an exclusive PDF guide included. Link in the description. See you inside. So instead of picturing our ancestors desperately choking down bugs because they had literally nothing else, picture them recognizing insects as one of the richest, most valuable food sources available to them, sitting right up there with the fattiest, most prized parts of any hunted animal. Grubs weren't the sad backup plan. Grubs were sometimes the jackpot. Reason number 3, and this is the one that barely anyone ever talks about: safety and energy efficiency. Hunting large animals is dangerous. Genuinely, seriously dangerous. In a way that's easy to forget from the comfort of a couch. A cornered boar can kill you. A wounded buffalo can trample you into the dirt without breaking stride. Ancient hunters absolutely died doing this regularly, and even successful hunts came with real risk of injury that, in a world without antibiotics, painkillers, or hospitals, could turn a small cut into a slow and unpleasant death sentence weeks later. Insects, on the other hand, do not gore you. Termites do not have hooves. A beetle grub cannot break your leg no matter how personally offended it is at being eaten. Foraging for insects was, comparatively, an extremely low-risk activity, which meant it could reliably be done by more members of a group, including children, elders, or anyone recovering from an injury, spreading the labor of survival across the whole community instead of dumping all the danger onto a handful of the strongest hunters. This actually connects to something anthropologists find genuinely compelling. Insect foraging may have played a massive, underappreciated role in keeping groups fed and stable during lean times. When big game was scarce, or hunts kept failing one after another, it was the reliable floor sitting quietly beneath an unreliable ceiling. Big game was the jackpot, exciting and impressive, but insects were the steady paycheck that showed up on time every single time, rain or shine, mammoth or no mammoth. Now, at this point, you might be sitting there thinking, okay, fine. Bugs were smart, bugs were nutritious, bugs were absolutely everywhere. So why on earth did we ever stop? If it was such a brilliant survival strategy, why does the modern world treat eating a single cricket like some kind of extreme bravery challenge on a reality show? This is where the story takes a turn, and honestly, it's a little bit tragic in a humanity accidentally shot itself in the foot kind of way. As agriculture developed, human diets began, shifting hard toward grains and eventually toward domesticated livestock. Farming meant more predictable, more controllable food sources. You didn't need to hope a swarm happened to show up that season. You could grow the food or raise the animal right there on your own land, on your own schedule, without leaving anything to chance. And as populations grew and cities formed, a strange psychological shift happened alongside the purely practical one. Wealth and status slowly became associated with the cleaner, more controlled foods, the farmed meats and the cultivated grains, while foraged foods, insects very much included, quietly got rebranded in a lot of cultures as something poorer, more rural, more primitive. Not because insects had gotten less nutritious overnight, not because they'd suddenly become unsafe, but purely because of social positioning. Eating bugs stopped being normal and started being embarrassing, in certain regions at least, entirely because of what it signaled about your social class rather than anything meaningfully wrong with the food itself. This is honestly one of history's great quiet ironies. The food that arguably kept humanity alive and thriving for tens of thousands of years got demoted to gross and backwards, not through any real scientific reassessment, but through the slow creep of status games and cultural embarrassment. Meanwhile, in huge parts of the world, including much of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, that demotion never really happened. which is exactly why you can still walk into a market in parts of Thailand or Mexico today and casually buy a bag of fried crickets like it's the most unremarkable purchase imaginable. Because it is. In places heavily shaped by certain European culinary traditions, though, the bug-eating stigma took hold hard, and it stuck for centuries, hardening into an almost instinctive reaction that had nothing to do with taste or nutrition and everything to do with inherited squeamishness. Which brings us to the deeply funny, deeply ironic modern twist in this entire story. Right now, scientists, nutritionists, and even some governments are looking at the exact same insects our ancestors casually snacked on for tens of thousands of years and going, wait, this might actually save us. Here's why. Raising cattle for meat is incredibly resource intensive. It takes enormous amounts of land, enormous amounts of water, and produces a significant chunk of global greenhouse gas emissions. It's one of the most inefficient methods imaginable for converting plant calories into protein calories, like trying to fill a bathtub through a coffee straw. Insects, on the other hand, are almost comically efficient by comparison. Crickets, for example, require a tiny fraction of the water and land needed to produce the same amount of protein as cattle, while generating far less greenhouse gas in the process. They grow fast, they reproduce fast, and they can be farmed vertically in small, stacked spaces without needing to clear a single forest or drain a single river. So the exact food source that got culturally shamed out of a lot of modern diets is now being seriously proposed as one of the keys to feeding a growing global population sustainably. Some companies are already producing cricket flour, insect-based protein bars, and insect-based pet food, quietly slipping bugs back into the modern diet under names that sound considerably less alarming than ground-up bugs, which, let's be honest, is exactly what they are, just dressed up in better packaging and a more confident font. Which, honestly, is kind of hilarious if you actually sit with it. We spent thousands of years perfecting the art of eating insects. Then we spent a few hundred years convincing ourselves it was disgusting. And now we're spending genuine research funding to convince ourselves to go back to doing exactly what we started with, except this time with better marketing, glossier packaging, and significantly worse table manners than our ancestors ever had. It's basically the food version of throwing out a perfectly good family heirloom, only to buy a nearly identical replacement decades later for triple the price and calling it innovative. There's also a fun little wrinkle worth mentioning here. A lot of people who insist they'd never eat a bug have, statistically speaking, already eaten several without knowing it. Trace amounts of insect material show up in all kinds of processed foods purely, because it's basically impossible to farm and harvest crops on a massive scale without a few stowaways sneaking through. So if the idea of eating insects horrifies you, I have some mildly uncomfortable news about that box of pasta in your pantry. So what does all of this actually tell us? What's the real takeaway buried under all these crunchy little facts and mildly uncomfortable pasta revelations? I think it's this. Our ancestors weren't primitive. They weren't desperate, half-starving cave people shoving whatever they could find into their mouths out of pure survival panic. They were making genuinely intelligent, efficient, calculated decisions about food. Decisions rooted in nutrition, safety, and abundance. Decisions that modern science is only now circling back around to fully validate with lab coats, funding grants, and peer-reviewed papers. The idea that eating bugs is primitive or gross isn't actually a scientific fact at all. It's a cultural accident, a social hiccup that happened to take root in certain parts of the world for a few centuries, while the rest of the planet simply kept doing what humans have always done, without ever needing to be told it was fine. And there's something oddly comforting in that, honestly. It means that somewhere in your genetic and cultural history, there's a version of your ancestors who looked at a fat, wriggling grub, roasted it over an open fire, and thought, yeah, this is a good day. Not a desperate day. Not a rock bottom, nothing else was available day. A good day. Possibly even a favorite meal. So the next time you see a novelty insect snack sitting on a shelf in a gas station, or you hear about some trendy restaurant putting toasted crickets on the menu as a bold new culinary experiment, just remember, it's not new. It's not bold. It's not even really an experiment. It's just dinner. The exact same dinner your ancestors have been eating for roughly 100,000 years, wearing a slightly fancier outfit and charging you $11 for the privilege. And honestly, given everything we now know about the nutrition, the sustainability, and the sheer staggering efficiency of insects as a food source, maybe the real question isn't why did ancient humans eat bugs daily? Maybe the real question is why did we ever stop, and how long it's actually going to take before all of us gas station snacks and fancy restaurants included are quietly doing it again.